The Rise and Fall of the Civil Rights Movement from 1963 to 1968. Narration by Hannah Thomas. The height of 1963. The Vietnam War began in 1955, although to 1963 this warfare started to get hostile after the Northern Vietnamese had made their decision to commit a military intervention in the guerrilla war in the South Vietnam, which created the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On September 15th, an explosion happened at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 innocent young black girls. This church was known for a meeting place for civil rights leaders. This incident not only affected African Americans in Alabama, but all over the South where majority of blacks lived. This was just one of the many episodes before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his iconic I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28th. This speech was the hope that America needed to move forward. The crowd began to rejoice and sing, "We shall overcome," to aspire for the belief in our future. With the belief, African Americans ran to President-elect John F. Kennedy for strength and faith in our nation and in the black community as far as segregation. Unfortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. During that time, the nation was damaged even more because their commander-in-chief was no longer in office. First Lady Kennedy and daughter Caroline were not the only ones mourning. The nation was also in grieving. We felt their pain as though they had lost one of their loved ones. As the nation was in complete shock, this event set the epitome for America's future as Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in office just hours after JFK's assassination in Dallas, Texas. With nearly 3 months of President Kennedy's assassination, the African American community suffered from equal rights and racial incidents. President Kennedy had a vision to seize all the harmful and damaging problems going on in the United States and also give equal voting rights to blacks. However, Dr. King and other civil rights leaders decided to visit the White House, where now President Johnson resided, and come to terms about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act that President Kennedy began. African Americans weren't giving up just yet. The youth of this race began to do sit-ins at segregated restaurants around the South. The first sit-in began on November 1st, 1960, when 4 black students from North Carolina A&T College sat down at Woolworth lunch counter in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. From then on, sit-ins became conventional and even injurious, while young African Americans are risking their lives for freedom. Even though some young adults were putting their lives up at risk in the summer of 1964, 3 young civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, were found missing in Philadelphia, Mississippi on June 21st. They were part of the Freedom Summer program where they were kidnapped and murdered by Ku Klux Klan members. Besides all the racial occasions that were happening, there was still a promised land left for African Americans, as President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination of race, gender, color, sex, religion, and national origin. This act is considered a landmark in the Civil Rights Movement era. Alongside For Hope and Triumph, months later, Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the nonviolent resistance to racial prejudice in America. At that time, Dr. King became the youngest member to ever receive this notable award. This achievement was a sign of satisfaction for African Americans. Throughout all the accomplishments that occurred in 1964, the year of 1965 was the year of fulfillment, and yet for some African Americans, started the year off with a feeling of pain and sorrow. In January, President Johnson was elected for his second term as Commander-in-Chief. He would soon carry out the remarkable Voting Rights Act. However, on February 21st, Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem at the Audubon Ballroom by some of the Nation of Islam workers. He was known for his activism to fight back, and violence was the answer for some African Americans to respond back. Although he and Dr. King had their differences on violence and nonviolence actions, they were both known for activism in the black community. Exactly 1 month after Malcolm X's assassination, 3,000 marchers left from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, completing one of the largest marches without opposition. This march was led by SCLC and SNCC leaders Hosea Williams and John Lewis, among with other civil rights leaders, in protest of the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson. State troopers and law enforcement officers began spraying them with tear gas and hoses. This event will be later known as Bloody Sunday. On August 6, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, which bans discriminatory voting requirements, like requiring people to complete literacy tests before they register to vote. White Southerners had used this technique to deprive blacks. This act was one of the major accomplishments in American history. Nearly 3 years later, life in the 60s had improved for African Americans until April 4, 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. This was a reminder to African Americans when President Kennedy was assassinated back in 1963. It was as if their present or fallen hero had elapsed. This event not only shook the black community, but a nation as a whole. Dr. King was known for his many triumphant accomplishments in pursuing at all races and gender that they should have equal rights, and not just only for African Americans. A week later, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, or the Fair Housing Act. This law restricted discrimination concerning the sale and rental of housing based on race, gender, religion, national origin, and sex. For many months, African Americans of all ages, especially college students who had attended historical black colleges, universities, and predominant white universities, began to protest for Dr. King's rights and rights on campuses. Throughout the year of 1968, many civil rights leaders tried to carry out the same goals and visions as Dr. King had in place. Leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson, along with many others. However, those visions soon turned to be a destruction of riots and hate toward one another. The Civil Rights Movement was a historic and remarkable time period in American history. Although it was filled with pain and sorrow, there was still joy and light on the other side. A lot of major achievements and laws were set in stone for not just that time period, but for the future. Leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X gave African Americans some hope for years later. For leaders like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and President Barack Obama, who are now carrying the torch, just like Dr. King and Malcolm X did for the future generation.